A couple days ago, we started the 2022 Louisville Football Position Previews, beginning with the quarterbacks. We now transition over into the running back position on this episode of the show. Let's get right on into it.
You are Locked On Louisville, your daily podcast on the Louisville Cardinals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? Welcome into this special weekend edition of the Locked On the Louisville podcast. I'm your host, Dalton Pence. I serve as a credential media member for Cardinals Sports Zone. I also do some PA announcing work for the university in various sports. I want to take this time to personally thank you for making us your first listen of the day. And just a reminder, the Locked On the Louisville podcast is free on all streaming services 5 days a week. Your team every day. As I mentioned, we are moving right along in the 2022 Louisville Football position by position previews. We will cover the running back position on today's episode of the show. First, by discussing what the depth chart may possibly look like. We will then transition into talking about expectations for the two newcomers, Tiyon Evans and Maurice Turner. And then finally, we will identify who could possibly serve as the X factor in the Louisville backfield. We'll start out with the possible depth chart. And let me go ahead and say it. Yes, it is over 90 degrees in Louisville, Kentucky on June 26th. But in this household, in the Pence household, it is freezing cold, which is the way we like it. So, yes, I am wearing a hoodie. And also, people have been giving me some crap about there not being a background. Look, I know I'm a big procrastinator, so I haven't addressed the background issue, but we are going to add a background to all of this here in the next month or so. What I'm saying is we'll get a background for next month. So be sure to check that out. I do apologize if it is not aesthetically pleasing to watch, so I do apologize. But moving right along, as we mentioned with the Louisville depth chart in terms of running back. And this is kind of one where, last season, there really wasn't a true depth chart. I think it was a matter of, going with the hot hand most games. Just because a player may be number one on the chart doesn't necessarily mean that they will receive the most carries in a certain ball game. We saw instances last year to where Jalen Mitchell got a lot of carries early on. Trevion Cooley throughout the middle and end of the season had some games where he had the most carries, and Hassan Hall had some big-time performances as well. So, the question really becomes, are we going to see anything different from Scott Satterfield and Lance Taylor? How do things change adding Lance Taylor into the mix? I'm not necessarily sure that they do at all. The number one thing to focus on here is that the fact that Louisville had one rusher that had over 1,000 yards on the ground last season. That was quarterback Malik Cunningham. Cunningham back for his final season in the Cardinals program this year. So you have to take everything with a grain of salt because, just because the depth chart may read one way or the other, I don't necessarily think it reflects who is getting the most carries. A lot of it's going to be based upon matchup. It is a great problem to have. That's what Darrell Sims, the running backs coach, said last season before the first game was, we have a lot of competition in this running backs room. It's a friendly competition. It's iron sharpening iron, which I love. The fact that, there are multiple guys that are really, going after it in practice and, in a healthy way and, putting their best foot forward. So it's good to have a problem to where you're trying to, divvy up the carries rather than not necessarily having a guy that's stepping up, but just having to go by committee because you don't have the guy. I think that Louisville has three players that could be the guy for any respective backfield. That's just how talented they are. And for an offense that runs the ball as much as they do, it's a good problem to have. You have to, focus on the fact that, Malik Cunningham is going to get a good amount of carries. He's going to run the ball a good amount because that's simply, Malik Cunningham at his finest when he's making decisions in the read option situations and also in tuck and carry situations. So I think that regardless of who the depth chart shows at number one, I think the point that I'm trying to get across is that it really truly doesn't matter. It might for like the first game, but even then, I think that it's going to be based upon who's carrying the ball well, what they're seeing from the defenses. There are running backs all in this room that bring different skill sets to the mix. I think that Jalen Mitchell is predominantly a power back, to where you're going to see him really be able to get inside the tackles, but he doesn't. He's not lacking of speed either. I think Trevion Cooley is more of a balanced, running back, to where he has a ton of speed, but also very, very solid in terms of power, and a good receiving back out of the backfield. You have Tiyon Evans, who comes in from Tennessee, who is a home run threat, maybe has the highest potential of all the running backs, potentially. Maybe has the highest potentially. Isn't that something? Jawhar Jordan, the guy who transferred from Syracuse before the beginning of last season, is the best receiving back on the squad. He's probably, the best change of pace back. And then you have a guy like Maurice Turner, who's coming in after playing wide receiver in high school, being recruited as a running back. And, we'll talk a little bit more about him, but he might be the best speed back, in terms of pure speed on the team. So, there's a lot of, guys in this position group that bring a lot of different skill sets to the table. And that's something that it is a luxury to have if you're Scott Satterfield and company, because it allows you to kind of prepare for any type of, packages that you're seeing from the defense. If they're, clogging the middle, maybe you go with a guy who's able to get on the outside. If they're daring you to run in the middle, then you have guys like Jalen Mitchell who can really make you pay in the middle. So the depth chart, I can't speak today. It's really kind of overblown. But for the sake of discussion, for the sake of hypotheticals, let's predict where the depth chart is going to land. And I honestly, before this episode, this was kind of one that I was dreading, because I truly don't know what's going to happen. There are 3 running backs that could be number 1 on the depth chart, and they all have serious cases that justify their being picked for number 1 on the depth chart. You start out with Jalen Mitchell. This is a guy who is a veteran that knows Scott Satterfield's offense. He was the second leading ball rusher last year, 722 yards, had 155 carries, had 5 touchdowns, which led all running backs, averaged 4.7 yards per carry. So, being a power back, a guy that is very experienced in ACC play, knows this offense probably better than anyone, having played in it for the past 2 seasons. Significantly, or really last year was the main significant run, and then the year prior to that, he got some good opportunities at the end of the season when you had guys like Javion Hawkins, who had an injury, I believe, and also Hassan Hall, who dealt with some injuries. So Jalen Mitchell is probably, in my opinion, I'd probably say he's going to start the season as the number 1. But that's just me. That's just me kind of playing it safe and trying to predict what you're going to see from Scott Satterfield in terms of the depth chart. Trevion Cooley has a significant case as well. He averaged 5 yards per carry last season. Had some instances to where he looked like the best running back on the squad last season. He had some games to where he really, really made some things happen. And it's like, wow, we haven't seen that since Javion Hawkins was on the squad and, playing for the team. So, Trevion Cooley, and also his potential to be a receiving back out of the backfield. That's something that you have to focus on as well. Malik Cunningham, toward the end of the season last year, we saw him check down to his receivers more so out in the flat, whether that be wide receivers or running backs. I think that Trevion Cooley could end up being, outside of Jawhar Jordan, maybe the best receiving back on the squad. And then you have a guy like Tiyon Evans, who from Tennessee, who is a home run threat. He's one of, he's a lot of, analysts and stuff like that have him ranked as one of the top 50 running backs in the country, which honestly, I feel like all 3 of these guys could be a top 50 running back in the country. That's just how good they are. So Tiyon Evans is, another guy who could definitely rise to the top of the rankings. Kind of reminds me of like a Michael Dyer. Had some success in the SEC, maybe not necessarily national championship success like Dyer had, but a kind of a smaller back in stature, but very powerful, very quick home run threat every time he touches the football. and could make things interesting for the Louisville backfield. So if you're making me predict a depth chart, I'm probably going Jalen Mitchell or Trevion Cooley at number 1. I'm going Tiyon Evans number 2. 3 would be Jawhar Jordan. I'm sorry, I guess 3 would be Tiyon Evans because one of those two, of Mitchell and Cooley, would be number 2. Jawhar Jordan would be 4, and Maurice Turner would be number 5. So I think that all 5 of these guys, if their number were called, they could come in and really put together some solid production. So I think that Jalen Mitchell, Trevion Cooley, and Tiyon Evans are primed for big seasons in this Louisville offense. Speaking of the newcomers, Tiyon Evans and Maurice Turner, what should we expect from them in their first years with the Louisville Cardinals program, respectively? We will talk about that here in just a second after we talk about our friends over at BetOnline. BetOnline has pretty much had you covered all season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. It is your number one source for all of your betting needs and sports info. Find all of the latest sports developments, league reviews, and news this season, including this year's NHL playoffs and Major League Baseball. It's your continued source for all of your sporting wagering information, including live betting, esports, and scores. And betonline.net is the best spot for all of your sports scores, podcasts, and news. It's the fastest and easiest way to check in on all of your favorite sports and events, including MMA, boxing, and golf. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline, where the game starts. Hey, Cardinal fans, thanks again for making Locked On Louisville your first listen of the day. I just want to take this time to remind you that it is free on all streaming services. That is 5 days a week, your team every day. Sorry, I completely exited out of the tab that I had on my computer that I was looking at for some unknown reason. But overall, I'm really excited about the newcomers for this team. Tiyon Evans and Maurice Turner, both in different situations. Evans, a transfer from the University of Tennessee, came from, I believe, the JUCO ranks. He's listed as I guess he has maybe 2 years tops. But last year, 81 carries, 525 yards, 6 touchdowns, 6.5 yards per carry, had 4 catches, 74 yards, and a score. The 5'11", 220-pound native of Hartsville, South Carolina, has been, talked about in a light of being a home run threat in the SEC. When I talked to a couple Tennessee fans that I know, I wanted to kind of get a gauge on how they felt about him, because I think that you can learn a lot about how a fan base feels about a player transferring out of the program. Obviously, sometimes it gets a little biased because there may be some negative emotions associated with the player deciding to transfer. But really, the only thing that I took away from Tennessee fans talking about Tiyon Evans is that they wished him the best of luck and they wish it would have worked out a little bit better in Knoxville. They said that he definitely has NFL potential. Was a player that, had he played consistently, was definitely a problem for SEC defenses, and you see that with 6.5 yards per carry. So I think that speaks volumes. That is something interesting to note. So the question now is, what to expect from Tiyon Evans here at the University of Louisville, statistically speaking? Will he even get back to where he was with 600-something yards or 500-something yards, whichever one it was? I'm not sure. But I don't necessarily think that if he were not to get back to that level, or if he were to maybe increase it just ever so slightly, I don't necessarily think that is an indication of him regressing or not improving, or it's really more so just the fact that Louisville has a lot of mouths to feed in terms of rushing the football. Malik Cunningham's going to get the most carries, or so one would think. 1,000 yards on the ground, 20 touchdowns to his name, top 10 in the country in rushing touchdowns. So that's something to focus on there, is the fact that, even though you have a very balanced backfield, and that's something that you have to look into and you have to focus on, and you really have to take with a grain of salt when you talk about statistics. on top of that, you have to really focus on the matter that the Cardinals have one of the best dual threat quarterbacks in the country. And Scott Satterfield is likely going to go back to how the offense worked last year in giving Malik Cunningham the opportunity to utilize the read option that worked so well, especially with the improvements that we saw across the offensive line for the Cardinals last season. So, sure, I think that I think improvement for Tiyon Evans isn't just a matter of statistics. I think that maybe yards per carry is something that you could focus on. I think it's more so just a matter of the eye test. How is Tiyon Evans looking on the field? Is he breaking tackles? Is he making something out of nothing? Is he hard to take down? Is he getting up to the second line of the defense? What is that looking like? And is he becoming more of a receiving back? So the question really isn't more so tuned to what's he going to do statistically. It's really focused on, okay, let's kind of gauge it with our eyes, because I think that if you were just to look at just raw numbers, that it kind of comes away in a different sense that might not necessarily paint the best picture of what you're getting from Tiyon Evans here at Louisville. So ultimately, I think that really what to expect. I think we're going to see him, rip off some big plays here for Louisville. I think we're going to see him get some long touchdowns. Just really add a dynamic to this offense and be the home run threat that we expect him to be, in the sense of just putting himself in a situation to where he's getting 5-6 yards per carry, and that's something to focus on. So the other newcomer is Maurice Turner, originally a wide receiver out of Douglas, Georgia, the 5'8", 170-pound native standout of Coffee High School. Was recruited by the University of Louisville as a running back, ranked as the 1,057th best prospect in the class. Really, this is one of those to where people were like, okay, what is the staff seeing in Maurice Turner? Well, really, if you've been paying attention to social media, you'll see that Tyreek Hill at a camp had one player tie him in a race, and that player was Louisville running back Maurice Turner. So the speed is there, and that's something that you look at and you're thinking, okay, could you see an instance to where it's like Corvin Lamb, to where once he touches the ball, if he can get to the second line of the defense, you're not going to catch him? Are we going to see him possibly on special teams? Do we see him used in like a Tutu Atwell role, to where maybe he doesn't necessarily line up truly as a wide receiver, but more so like in end arounds, slants, getting the ball to him out in the flat and trying to get him to make some guys miss. The expectation shouldn't necessarily be all that high for Turner in year one. In fact, I would probably go as far as suggesting that this is likely a redshirt year for Maurice Turner. If it is not a redshirt year, I would expect him to be a player on social teams, special teams. I'm thinking social media with the Tyreek Hill camp thing. But if he were not to redshirt, I think it's because he would be a regular on special teams in terms of kick and punt returning. So, I mean, that's not an indication of him not necessarily being ready for the task at hand. I think it's really obviously, it's pretty straightforward here. Let's call a spade a spade. It's the fact that it's very crowded in the Louisville backfield. So Maurice Turner likely will have to wait his turn. But I'm confident that he's definitely going to make an impact in the next years to come. So newcomer-wise, Tiyon Evans is going to be a big part of the offense. Obviously, Maurice Turner, it is just going to take some time. So, but now it's time to look into who is the X factor for the Louisville football running backs group. That answer, Jawhar Jordan. We'll explain why here in just a second after we tell you about our friends over at Rock Auto. With the ever-increasing number of makes and models, it's now impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts you need. Why endure often pointless or seemingly intimidating questioning and wait while the person behind the counter orders the parts on their computer, ordering the only brand their warehouse happens to carry? Rock Auto, it's pretty straightforward. Save time and money. It is a family business. It serves do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years. The prices are reliably low for every customer. They have everything you could ever need, from brake parts, tail lamps, motor oil, and even new carpet. Go explore their easy-to-use website today to find the solution to your auto parts needs. That website is rockauto.com, and see all the parts available for your car or truck. Right Locked On in there "How did you hear about us" box, so they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. The final segment of the show, I want to answer the question, who is the biggest X factor for this Louisville football running backs group? Well, I did answer that. That is Jawhar Jordan, the Syracuse transfer from last year. Last season didn't necessarily have a ton of run. He did have a big kickoff return for a touchdown last season in the Serve Pro First Responder Bowl game, which helped the Cardinals kind of get back into the game. But last year, really not much to go off of. He averaged 6.7 yards per carry in under 100 yards of total action. In 3 years of college football, has not rushed for over 105 yards. That came in 2019 as a freshman at Syracuse. The 5'10", 186-pound native of Chandler, Arizona, I think is the X factor for this group because he is truly the change of pace back for this team. I think that Tiyon Evans, Jalen Mitchell, and Trevion Cooley, despite being very different, are the same in the sense of they're very powerful backs that have kind of deceptive speed and really are able to make guys miss and get to that second level of the defense. I think that Jawhar Jordan has the highest receiving upside. I like the change of pace back there. I think that you're going to see him involved more so in third down situations in the upcoming season. And one of the reasons why I think it took a little while for Jawhar Jordan to get into the kind of the I can't even think of what I'm trying to say. Get into the number of carries per game, the deviation of carries, is because you had a change in pace back in Hassan Hall. When Hassan Hall was healthy, he gave you that receiving caliber running back, the kind of the smaller in stature, but really is able to get out into the flat. And if you give him some room, he can definitely make something out of nothing. So now that Hassan Hall is gone, you add in a guy like Tiyon Evans to replace him. I think that Tiyon Evans is really more so more alike to Trevion Cooley than he is Hassan Hall. So it kind of opens up the possibility if Trevion Cooley, if Scott Satterfield and Lance Taylor want to go with an option to, as a kind of a change of pace back, more of a receiving back option, a player that utilizes more so speed rather than kind of agility and power. I think that Jawhar Jordan could be the X factor. And just think about it. If Jawhar Jordan starts to show off and show out, how difficult is it going to be for opposing defensive coordinators to try to plan for the Louisville rushing attack? Not only do you have to try to stop Malik Cunningham, and that alone is a very tall task. We saw that last year. The guy, combined for 20 touchdowns or 39 overall touchdowns, 20 of those being on the ground. So you're obviously trying to focus on the read option aspect of it, and you always have to kind of keep a spy on Malik Cunningham. But now, if you add Jawhar Jordan into the mix, there are 4 legitimate running backs that you might have to plan for. Okay, you may have to go plan for a guy like Jalen Mitchell, to where if you let him get outside the tackle, well, it's going to be tough to stop him, but he also can excel inside because he's a power back. And then you have a guy like Trevion Cooley who can literally do it all. Or maybe you've got those guys kind of bottled up, but hey, here comes Tiyon Evans, who is arguably, has the most potential on the squad. Maybe you have all 3 of those guys taken care of. Well, now you have a guy like Jawhar Jordan who brings a little bit of a different skill set to the mix, doesn't really utilize power, but more so a lot of speed, agility, making guys miss, being able to bounce out to the outside and really make things interesting for the defense. So ultimately, I think Jawhar Jordan kind of serves as the X factor here, and that's no disrespect to any of the other guys. I just think that if he gets going and he makes it to where he has to get some carries and he has to get some opportunities and he has to get some snaps and touches, it's going to be almost impossible for opposing defensive coordinators to truly plan for all 4 of these running backs, except for just stacking the box. in making Louisville throw the ball. And if Malik Cunningham is able to, take the next step forward, that's going to be difficult to stop. I think the Louisville offense is really in a good spot. So we discussed the Louisville football next positional preview. That is the running backs department. Tomorrow's episode possibly will be focused on recruiting. If not, we will transition over into the wide receiver group positional preview. But hey, that's going to wrap up this edition of the show. Thanks again for making Locked On Louisville your first listen of the day. Do yourself a favor, make Locked On ACC your second listen of the day, hosted by Candace Cooper. There's no better way to learn about the upcoming opponents for the Louisville football schedule and pretty much the conference as a whole. So be sure to check that out. Check out the show on YouTube, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, etc. Thanks again for taking the time to out of your busy Sundays to check into the show. I appreciate it. Everyone have a great end to your weekend. Start the week out great. We will see you right back here on Monday.